Now we come into our next session, that is breakthroughs in nature. In my work, either at Sashamama, our nonprofit organization, or at Telemundo Network, where I am a correspondent, I make a point of honoring nature, because I think it's definitely where I feel more connected, grounded, and grateful. And we believe in Sashamama that we have a very intimate connection with our planet, because after all, it's a system that sustains us, that gives us everything that we need to survive. It makes sure that we have a stable climate, that we're able to live, to give us pure water to drink, good food to eat, and of course, clean air to breathe. So we own everything to our planet, and it's just a necessity of us to take care of it. So in our next session, they are going to talk about the breakthroughs they are seeing and working on putting nature at the center stage. And here to moderate this session is our dear Lisa Renstrom. Lisa is a trustee and co-founder of Bowman Social Investment and former president of the Sierra Club. She was a founding and is currently an ecoAmerica board member, and currently chairs the board of Confluence Philanthropy and Interfaith Power and Light. We are very proud to have her. She is amazing, so please welcome Lisa Renstrom.
Hello, my relatives. And thank you to the Piscataways upon whose land we live here in DC. I was so excited to be asked to moderate a panel called Breakthroughs in Nature and Carbon Capture. When this country finally pivots and begins entrepreneurially, energetically, and enthusiastically solving the climate dilemma, nature is going to be with us. It's going to be on our side. She's there. We understand nature's power when it manifests as a hurricane, as a fire, or as a flood. And we can be amazed at the daily, minute-by-minute power of nature to sequester carbon. As every crop, tree, flower, blade of grass grows, it sequesters carbon. Our oceans and wetlands sequester carbon. We learned the process in grade school. Animals and plants breathe in the oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants use that carbon dioxide plus sunshine to make food and to grow big. The carbon becomes part of the plant, but it lets go of the oxygen, and we breathe that oxygen back in, and so the cycle goes on with every breath and intake. We have 4 outstanding panelists today, and we're going to do 3-minute opening statements, followed by about a 25-minute discussion to talk about how nature and carbon, we, government and business, can empower nature to do its thing. So I'd like to ask you to take a deep breath. Breathe in the spirit, breathe out. Let us shine light on this part of this natural cycle. So I'm going to talk about how to sequester and partner with nature with Andrew Bowman. Andrew is president of the Land Trust Alliance. Prior to the Land Trust, he served as the environmental program director at the Duke Doris Charitable Foundation. He fervently believes that land and land conservation can bring people together to find common ground and enable healing that our nation needs. Robert Bonney, at the other end, under Barack Obama, served as Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Currently, he is working with students and faculty on climate change, natural resource conservation, with a focus on rural America at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. Carter Roberts, next to Andrew, is president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund in the United States. He leads WWF's effort to save the world's great ecosystems and address climate by linking and bridging the work of markets and business so that they together can partner with us on climate solutions. And Jason Albritton directs climate and energy policy and the U.S. government relations at the Nature Conservancy, and Mr. Albritton is from Kentucky. So if you all want to stand at the podium or just speak here, we will start with Andrew.
All right, great, thank you. And do we have the clicker? I'll start while there's one slide in a second. Good morning, everybody. I know we're standing between you and lunch, so we're going to keep this active, lively, yes. As the morning's gone on, I think it's become very clear that, thank you, I don't have a slide? Well, I hope I have a slide. It's become very clear that it's late in the game when it comes to mitigating climate change, and that it's going to require an all-the-above type of strategy. So today, or this particular session, we're going to talk about natural climate solutions and hopefully convince you that natural climate solutions when it comes to climate mitigation are real and significant. So what do I mean by natural climate solutions? Here we're talking about how do we enhance the ability of the natural world to absorb and sequester carbon. And we're also talking about how we can change our land use practices so we cause fewer emissions to get into the atmosphere. I want to talk about a study that, again, I guess we don't have a slide. So there's a study that came out in 2017 that was led by the Nature Conservancy. And it involved 32 other really prominent scientists from around the world. And they did sort of a meta-analysis of what natural climate solutions could achieve around the world. And they looked at a number of things. They looked at conservation, which is about preventing land from being converted to other uses like development. They looked at restoration, such as reforestation, and they looked at improved land management practices, say with agriculture. They looked across all biomes, forests, wetlands, grasslands, agricultural lands, and they looked at all latitudes. This wasn't just focused on the tropics, which for so long that's what we've done when we've talked about natural climate solutions. Again, I thought we'd have a graph up here, but let me describe it to you. We all know the graph that shows business as usual, emissions going up, up, and up. And we know at the bottom of that same graph, you see the 2 degree or 1.5 degree centigrade path or trajectory that we need going down. And what they determined is they looked at 2030 and they put that on that type of graph and they said, okay, what do we have to get done between now and 2030 to stay on a 2 degree C path? And how much can be accomplished just with natural climate solutions? And what they concluded was 37%. Now, let's call it a third. It's a lot. And I will say the same group of scientists did a similar study just for the US that came out about a year later. And basically, they concluded that 20% of US emissions can be prevented or sequestered by natural climate solutions. So again, what I want to emphasize here is this is real. These solutions are available now. They're affordable, and they have tremendous co-benefits: clean water, clean air, places to recreate, places for wildlife to flourish. So that's my main point. Natural climate solutions are real, and that's why we have this session at this conference. Let's go back and touch base real quick on the 3 different methods. We talked about conservation first. I'm the president and CEO of the Land Trust Alliance. We represent 1,000 land trusts across the country. These are community-based groups that are protecting forever places in your communities. They have protected more than 56 million acres to date, and every day they protect and conserve the equivalent of 6 central parks. So I just want to emphasize that this is a place where you can play, where you can participate. This is a nonpartisan, effective way to make natural climate solutions work. Now, of course, I also mentioned restoration, particularly reforestation, and improve ag practices. How are we going to get those to where we need to? How are we going to get to scale? This is all about figuring out how to get revenue streams to the owners of working lands. You could do this through regulatory processes like California's cap and trade system, which has an offset program as well, Or maybe it's federal incentive programs that just drive subsidies and incentives to landowners. The point is we have to find a way to give landowners that incentive to manage their lands differently. And the last point I want to make, and I believe Robert's going to build on this, is if we do that, if we find a way that we're moving dollars and cents on a regular basis to rural landowners across this country, I think it can change the political calculus around climate change policy in this country, which is something we also need. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. So I think as Andrew pointed out, there's enormous opportunity here to do well by ecosystems and to do well by climate at the same time. And I want to also underline the fact that there's a real opportunity to do well by agriculture and forestry as well, not only domestically but internationally. So when I was in the Obama administration, we made tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars investments in conservation practices that had direct benefits for climate change through reducing greenhouse gas emissions and making forestry and agricultural operations more resilient. And in a time when you think about climate policy being really polarized, people fighting about it, when we did that, we got absolutely no pushback. None. None from agriculture, none from forestry. Why? The reason for that, I think, is that there is a lot of alignment. There's a lot of alignment for the types of practices that we want to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the types of things that landowners, farmers, ranchers, and forest owners already want to do to make their operations more profitable and to make their operations more sustainable. So on the ag side, things like conservation tillage that reduce the amount of tillage, sequester carbon in the soil, cover crops that also sequester carbon in the soil, or even nutrient management that has the potential to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, a very powerful greenhouse gas. Those things not only can benefit the climate, but they can also improve landowners' bottom lines. Same thing on the forestry side. On the forestry side, when you think about the types of activities we want, Andrew talked about some of them: forest restoration, reforestation, things to improve forest health, to reduce the threat of catastrophic wildfire, to reduce the impacts of insects and disease. Those things, again, can have enormous climate benefits at the same time that they have enormous benefits for the productivity of our forests. There's also alignment in another way. If we think about the types of activities we want landowners, land managers to undertake to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, they're oftentimes the same type of activities that we want them to undertake to improve the resilience of those ecosystems. And let me give you a couple examples. One is catastrophic wildfire in the West. We've removed natural fire from so many ecosystems in the West. We've built up fuels. We now have climate change on top of that. And so we have a serious problem with unnaturally hot, catastrophic large fires in the West. If you want to address that issue, you need to improve forest health through thinning and through the reintroduction of more natural fires and prescribed fires. Those types of things over the long term will improve the ability of those ecosystems to store carbon, just as they make those ecosystems more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Likewise on the agricultural side. So in 2012, we have an enormous drought that impacted agricultural land across the country. When I was at USDA, what we saw was that those landowners that were doing good soil management practices, that were storing carbon in the soil, that were thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, were also the landowners that actually made it through the drought best. Their crops were more resilient, their soil held more water, and so those types of activities that both reduce greenhouse gas emissions are also the same activities oftentimes that actually allow those ecosystems and those agricultural systems to be more resilient. So there's a lot of alignment. There's alignment between mitigation and resilience, and there's alignment between what we want landowners to do for the climate, but also what's potentially good for their bottom line. So why aren't landowners jumping out and doing this stuff? Well, there are also costs associated with many of these activities. There are risks. Some of these practices are new, right? And so this is where government policy comes in, and thinking about how do we incentivize, how do we encourage these types of activities out on the landscape. Now, one thing you could think about trying to regulate these types of things. And what I would argue to you is that I don't think regulation is very well suited to improving the types of conservation practices that we want on the land. First, agriculture and forestry operations tend to be very diverse. And so writing regulations actually might be difficult. The other thing is thinking about how you regulate carbon. There are high transaction costs, how you measure carbon, those types of things on land. And so I think that's another reason that regulation might not work particularly well. Needless to say, regulation can also be very controversial. Landowners have had interaction with things like the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, wonderful laws, but somewhat controversial in rural parts of the country. And I think lastly, we need to think about building alliances. So thinking about more incentive-based approaches, more market-based approaches, I think is going to be important. Andrew mentioned the opportunity for offsets. Offsets have been a tool that have been utilized in the California greenhouse gas program. We funded offset projects when I was a part of USDA. And I think offsets could be part of certainly part of the solution. What I will tell you, though, is that I think we're going to have to make big public investments in this, and that we need to start preparing policy makers for the fact that the public is going to have to invest. We're going to have to create incentives, whether it's through things like Farm Bill conservation programs or other tools. I think we have to prepare policymakers for opening up their wallets and making investments. We need to move quickly. Some of these things are going to take significant investments, and I think we need to prepare for the public to be able to do that. And you actually might think about the type of approach where you might put the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the position of actually buying carbon, actually creating a carbon market by putting real dollars on the table, both that would ensure that a carbon market had environmental integrity, just as it gave landowners certainty that they could expect a certain return from these types of practices. Let me just conclude by saying there's an enormous opportunity here on the land side. There's an enormous opportunity to do things that are good for ecosystems, that are good for wildlife, that are good for water, but that are also good for rural communities, for economic development in rural communities, and I think landowners, agriculture, and forestry will ultimately support. Thanks.
Carter.
People regularly ask me, what are the most challenging issues that WWF faces in the world? And we work across 100 countries. And I always say that there are two issues that the world faces today. One is the scourge of climate change, and the other one is the destruction of nature upon which we all depend. And of course, what this panel is beginning to give voice to is how much those two issues are interrelated in many ways. But when people ask me what's the greatest challenge we have in that respect, I often say it's not about technology. The technologies are available. It's not about practices. The practices are available. It is about politics, and it is about politics most particularly in one country in the world, which is this country and this city right now. At WWF, as we wrestle with how we approach this, it has become clear to us that as we work with almost everyone in this room toward a moment in time when it is common and regular for politicians across the spectrum to talk about the reality of climate change and to work together toward a set of incentives that move us more strongly in the direction of solving climate change, that it is also important to engage the real economy in this country, cities, states, universities, faith-based groups, and businesses. And of that whole constellation of actors, the one I want to talk about the most right now are businesses, because we have built partnerships around the world with some of the world's largest businesses, many of them, most of them. And the results are encouraging in that the business community it recognizes the threat of climate change and is taking steps to act on it. We now have over 550 of the world's largest businesses who have adopted science-based targets, peer-reviewed targets, to set goals to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and then to begin to execute on those with others. And in all of those cases, it requires companies not just to look within the four walls of their operations, but to go through their partnerships, their supply chains, and as often as not, that leads you right down to the ground on how food is produced, how land is managed, how water is used, and on and on. And so when we're talking about companies like Walmart or McDonald's or Unilever or Mars or Coca-Cola, inevitably you get to land use and you get to real places where real land use change needs to occur and where a new form of producing food needs to occur. Now, all these businesses came together in New York City and set these big overarching targets in the New York Forest Declaration a number of years ago. And yet most of them did not have a plan quite how to get there. And as they make progress toward this over time using tools like science-based targets, it has become clear that they can do all kinds of creative things, but at the end of the day, they also have to engage on regulation. At the end of the day, they also have to engage on regulation if they are going to honor the targets that they've set. So Walmart, for instance, we've worked with Walmart, with Environmental Defense Fund and others, on a groundbreaking new initiative to pull 1 billion tons of emissions out of their supply chain. They have every year pulled together hundreds of their suppliers in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is not easy to get to look at the specific goals that they're setting. And we just had the latest meeting like this. And there is real progress being made. But it is also clear that unless you create in countries like Malaysia or Indonesia or Brazil or the United States the right kind of regulatory and governance construct, that you cannot quite deliver on the ground the kind of land use policies, the kind of governance overlay, the kind of incentives that we need, not just to move those companies, but to move everybody. And so the most promising thing that I see right now is that these companies have all created a clear evidence of the kind of practices and technologies that work. They have begun to create the proof point that climate change is real and there are real ways to get after it. And they have begun to create a nonpartisan community of actors in the real economy that have committed to this and getting after it. And they are now, and I'll talk about this later, beginning to experiment with new trade associations and new forms of engaging governments that I think will unlock what is fundamentally the key to moving on climate change, not just on energy, but also on land use. And I think their voice and their examples and their influence will be one of the most pivotal factors in getting to where we need to get on climate change around the world and on land use around the world, and most particularly in this country. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a good segue for what I want to talk a little bit about political will and how nature fits into how we're going to achieve climate policy in this country. As someone who works on a nearly daily basis on how to get Congress to move forward on climate change, my work really revolves around one big question, which is how do we make solutions to climate change broadly accepted so that we can ensure they will be implemented and continued and maintained. And I think all of the speakers have kind of touched on that topic in different ways. We do need ambitious federal climate policy in this country. We need a price on carbon. That's a given. We're working towards that. But to solve climate change, we also need a range of policies. There's not one single solution to climate change, but a solution set, and we need to engage on all aspects of that set. I think the role of nature and natural climate solutions is one important part of the solution set, and it's often a part of the solution set that we think gets ignored, which is why it's important to bring attention to the role that it can play. If we're going to address the challenge of climate change, which really grows more urgent every day, we need all solutions on the table, particularly those like natural climate solutions that we know can make a significant contribution to solving the problem and can be implemented now because we know what to do. As you heard earlier from Andrew, TNC, the Nature Conservancy, recently worked with dozens of different leading scientists to show here in the US we can eliminate up to a fifth of our carbon emissions from nature and how we use nature as a carbon sink. And that research found 21 different pathways where nature can play a key role in taking carbon pollution out of the air. These pathways that were identified in our research identify an array of land management practices, like better managing our forests across the country, reforestation in places like Louisiana, restoring grasslands in places like Montana, and encouraging low-till and no-till farming in places like Iowa. And another big piece is blue carbon. That's the role that our coastal ecosystems, like tidal marshes and mangroves, can help in pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So I think the point of this research is that all parts of the country have a role to play and have ecosystems that contribute to solving this problem. And as we look at the bigger problem of climate change, yes, we need to reduce emissions. Yes, we need to focus on the energy sector. But removing carbon from the atmosphere is going to be a central piece of attacking this challenge and avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. As you heard from earlier speakers in the day, there's already a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and we have to work to reduce that. So nature can be essential here, and these solutions, as I said, can be implemented now, so we should get started on it. There's also a potential for new technologies to play a role, which we think works well with nature. That's why TNC as an organization looks at things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which earlier panelists talk about, to how all of these solutions can be part of the solution set and work together to solve this monumental challenge. And so just like we need a range of policies and solutions, we also need a broad range of support and diverse support. If we're really going to have durable solutions that can garner political support across the political perspective and across the political spectrum and ensure they will last. We simply can't afford to let climate change solutions be subject to the whims of the latest election, be subject to which party is in control. We really have to find things that can appeal across the spectrum. And this will require people to support our solutions, all kinds of people, lots of different perspectives, including some who may be reticent to engage in this because of fear of how it may change the way they currently live and work. So we have to engage there. The Nature Conservancy is working with people of all backgrounds in this effort. One example, I think, that illustrates the thinking we need on this issue is our work in West Virginia. The Nature Conservancy's West Virginia program has been engaging all kinds of stakeholders across the state, including stakeholders like coal miners and coal workers who stand to be impacted by any transition as a result of climate policy, to find a way and a shared vision that the economy can move forward and nature can be a central part of that. And through a series of summits in that state, we're working to find those solutions that can garner broad support. And the conversations are already producing interesting ideas, like how can we use former mine lands to provide a new economic use, like reforestation, like solar energy, things that help us move forward economically, build support, harness the role of nature, and find solutions. So this is not a problem that's going to be solved by one idea, one person, or even one party. I think we need to look for those solutions, including the essential role of nature in moving forward and to build the support that we're going to need to tackle this problem. Thank you.
All right. I have enough, I think that we can totally fill 30 minutes in a discussion and talking, but I would like to leave the last 10 minutes for some audience questions. So if anybody has any questions, write them down and you can raise your hand and I will stop at a quarter till. Let's see, I'm going to start with, we're a really white audience, a white panel. How does carbon...
We're a white male panel.
Fair.
With a female facilitator.
And that's not your guys' fault. But
no, but we can do better.
Well, let's do better. Let's talk about how as you all in your roles and leadership roles think about employing, partnering with nature around carbon solutions, how do you address climate injustice issues and equity as we implement those solutions?
Look, it's we've talked about this earlier. I think in almost all the places we talk about, whether it's farmland or forest land or river systems or coral reefs, people live there. And those places are their source of food, it's their source of livelihood. And if you simply implement programs there, and you do it ostensibly for the benefit of people, that's not good enough. You have to do it starting with the voice of those communities, to build programs with those communities, to make sure that the benefits accrue as much to those communities as they do to the businesses or the governments that are implementing those programs, and that their voices are a part of it from stem to stern, from the beginning to the end of those programs, so the benefits are equitably shared. That is how you do it. It's less about the program itself, it's how you conduct the program.
So if I could echo that, at the Land Trust Alliance, we work with our members all the time on what we call community conservation, and it's exactly what Carter's talking about, that you need to go out and understand your community. Who hasn't already been served or is moved by land conservation? Listen to them, figure out what they need, and then save the lands that they want. That could be to protect local farms, it could be farms in cities, it could be community gardens, it can be places they want to recreate, it can be places that are sacred to them. So I think, again, there's great overlap that if you're doing land conservation and you're doing it right, you will get the carbon benefits, but first and foremost, you're serving your local community.
So I would just add and echo that. I mean, engaging communities is at the core of our work. The example I gave about West Virginia, it's all about working with people and what they want to see for their future and figuring out how we can find solutions that work for them. And so that's central to our approach. We work in all 50 states from the ground up to really engage the communities that need to be engaged. But I think another point about nature and the role it can play and how it can address some of these broader challenges, there are a lot of benefits for using nature as a climate solution. It also provides other things like clean air and clean water. And particularly in communities that suffer the impacts of pollution, I think investing in nature as a climate solution also helps address some of these other persistent challenges that communities face, and particularly in urban areas. And urban reforestation is a part of how we can use nature to address the climate, but also deal with some of these other long-standing impacts that many of these communities face.
Yeah, and I'll just add, obviously we know internationally, if you think about tropical deforestation, which is a huge part of the equation, you've got indigenous communities in a lot of those places. When I was at Environmental Defense Fund, I had a colleague that used to work with the indigenous communities because he knew if he protected their lands, that was actually going to be a really good climate solution as well as a biodiversity solution. As Carter mentioned, it's critically important as we design these solutions that we make sure that the benefits actually accrue to the folks on the ground, to those communities. As you think about this domestically, I mentioned the challenges of forestry in the West, catastrophic wildfire. The tribes in the West are really important partners in all this. If we think about how we address issues like that, large-scale forest restoration, we need to actually be able to manage across ownership. So thinking about how you work directly with tribes, as well as local communities, state governments, and others is going to be critically important. And I'll mention one other thing. When I was at USDA, some of the coolest work I think I did while I was at USDA was actually with African-American landowners in the South. As many of you may know, we've had tremendous losses of African-American farmers in the South due to persistent racism and other things over a long, long period of time, and USDA implicated in that. And so their efforts to actually stabilize and create new opportunities for not only that community but other communities. And it's interesting, the level of interest in conservation in those communities, the interest in keeping those lands as part of their sort of family legacy. And so the real opportunity to sort of mix those issues, equity issues, as well as long-term conservation, which will have climate benefits. Last point I'll make is that if you look at agriculture, sort of the fastest growing part of agriculture, the fastest sort of demographic, women and Latinos. So the real opportunity is to think about how do you structure programs that bring in new folks, new communities into agriculture. And I think if we do right by conservation, we'll do right by the climate as well.
Great, thank you. Continuing, on the topic of what's right and what makes sense and what is long-term, I always think of, if we can rape nature or people or cultures, that it's all kind of like our stopping, our collective stopping of that is if we address climate change in the right way, in this way, from listening to the people who are being affected by it most, and then we will solve a myriad of other problems, and we call them co-benefits. But we come at that not from a bottom line, but maybe a triple bottom line, and we come at that from a moral perspective or a faith perspective. And a lot of what ecoAmerica does is we work with the faith communities. And so I know that Jason and Robert, you said that you come from a faith tradition, and I'd love it if you could just share a little bit about how you bring that into your work.
So I think a lot about in my faith, but also in the work I do. I think a lot about the word stewardship. And obviously, stewardship is a critical concept when you think about ecosystems and sustainability. But as everybody has mentioned, the people part of this question is critically important. Aldo Leopold said the two things really interested him: the relationship of people to land and people to each other. And if we're going to solve this problem, we have to get the people to each other part of this. And so I think this is about stewardship, not only of land, but stewardship of communities. So I think about that in all we do. And the conversation we just had about equity and those things is really, really important. So I think there's been a tendency for some folks in the environmental community to think, just to think about ecosystems sort of apart from people. And I think my faith and my experience says we actually have to think about people as part of the not only the challenge we have, but the solutions as well.
So for me, lifelong Roman Catholic, faith is a centerpiece of everything I do. It's why I'm in this field. I think there's a moral reason to act to deal with these challenges for many of the reasons that Robert talked about, not just for the sake of protecting nature, but because we as human beings need it and we rely on it. And it's a gift to us that we're given to steward and continue for future generations. I'm heartened by the leadership of the Catholic Church and Pope Francis, particularly on this issue of calling attention to why climate change is a moral issue, why it's a human issue, and why we have to consider all of those things. So I bring that to my personal passion for this issue, but I think there's a fundamental piece, whether you're a person of faith or not, that we have to think about how the people-nature nexus exists and why we're doing this, and it's to preserve a world that's there for future generations, that can be used and people can thrive and live in future generations. And if we ignore that, and if we ignore the challenges we face, we're dooming future generations. And so I think that's the motivator for me, and I think that has to be at the center of our work as we work to challenge or work to tackle these challenges.
Carter, I know that you've Andrew, working with the corporate world and the government. As you work with these leaders, obviously you find lots of reasons to appeal to their incentives, and whether that's a profit incentive or a power incentive or a niche market incentive. How much does the moral thing, the heart, come into any of those relationships or that incentive? And you can also focus on the other things that there's important in those getting those people to act and in ways that partner with nature.
I would just answer by saying you generalize corporate leaders and political leaders at your peril. They are people just like we are. They have different sets of values. There are companies that are quite deep on values and their relationship to customers. Walmart, for instance, is wholly focused, almost totally focused on moms who buy groceries for their families. And that's the voice they hear the loudest. They talk to moms all the time, and they care very deeply about the entirety of those families and their experience and what they care about. And it helps when you've got companies like Walmart and Mars, for instance, that have a very large, Mars is 100% family owned. Walmart, it's not an inconsequential percentage, but that those families bring their values to how those companies operate in a leadership way. So you find political leaders, and I've called them political leaders with generals from the military because they care deeply about the security of the world and the security of our country, and they see how important nature is to that. I've called on senators with faith-based leaders because those are voices they care a lot about. And so I think my sense is it's not just the big money that funds the super PACs, although you'd be crazy if you didn't recognize that that is a force in our society, not always for the good. But there are also other voices that they listen to. And I think for us in the work that we do, we are always at our best when we don't show up alone, when we show up with other players from the military, from the business sector, from faith-based communities, from civil society that share the same kind of values and the same concerns we have.
I guess what I'd comment on, and this gets to a bit what people in the audience can do. So I travel the country all the time. We have members throughout the country, urban places, rural places, conservative, liberal, and wherever you go, all the people we serve in the Land Trust Alliance, they love land, and they might have fundamentally different reasons for that. But what I've noticed is we do a lot of work here on Capitol Hill, and we bring our members to Capitol Hill to speak to their representatives and their senators. And they express that love of land and why they have it, and it resonates with those politicians, not just because they're in their district, but they often share that same value system. And to me, it shows the power when people like everyone in this audience come to DC and they meet with their representatives or senators and say, we want this is important to us. It really works. And it's another reason why land conservation is nonpartisan. Everybody fundamentally loves land for different reasons again, but we can all agree that we want it conserved, we want it healthy, we want it restored and sustainable.
Let me just add, if you listen to Carter and I, you might think that there was a disagreement. Carter talked about the importance of accountability, and I think ultimately passing some regulation as part of, national climate law. And I talked about the challenges of a regulatory approach as you think about these issues in conserving land for the benefit of the climate. There's actually no disagreement. We absolutely have to have accountability and some legal framework that enforces real limitations on greenhouse gases. But as you think about the land sector, the question is, how do we apply that in a way that I think incentivizes this work, that brings those landowners into conservation? And whether that's through a cap and trade program or proceeds from offsets or a carbon tax. I think the point I made was thinking about how you structure policy in a way that actually can bring the agriculture and forestry community our way is important. I think corporations have an important role to play there as well because they're starting to see consumer demand for more sustainable products and those types of things. So there's an opportunity there, I think, to capture some of that momentum as well.
I will say this, though. Robert and I disagree on many, many, many things.
Yeah, we actually don't like each other very much.
We don't. The only thing we agree on is one person who Robert used to work with and who I am married to,
yeah,
who is magnificent. But And you might also believe that Robert is faith-based, and I'm not, since we pivoted from faith-based to business. But there is a continuity here that I think is super important. And if you want members of Congress or you want businesses to hear you, if you want communities to even listen to you, you have to start with where they are. And for members of Congress, at least in my experience, even whether you look at the appropriation cycle or whether you look at policies that have been passed, one of the most promising, deep, bipartisan issues in which they come together around is love of nature, love of land, and love of species. The International Conservation Caucus is a wonder to behold. It is deeply, deeply bipartisan. I wish we could create that on climate change. But but starting often with where people live and what they love, and finding a way to bridge from that to the issue of climate change, I think is where we are going to be able to reach the key Republicans and the key Democrats that we need to pass bipartisan legislation, which is why this panel and this topic, I think, is so important.
And I think that captures the challenge before us well. We have to figure out how to make the issue of climate change and acting on climate change as bipartisan as the issue of conserving land. And I think this is one pathway there, but I think the other is for people from communities that are seeing why this is an important issue to tell that to their members of Congress in a real and compelling way. That's what's going to change minds on this, and I think we have to redouble our efforts to do that if we want to be successful.
I would just add, Andrew alluded to this. You look at the map following both the 2016 election and the 2018 election. Rural is red, urban is blue. A lot of the issues we're talking about, they have clearly benefits for folks in urban, but if we do them right, they potentially have the real benefits, economic benefits, for folks in those red parts of the country. And ultimately, if we're going to pass legislation to get real accountability and get real caps on greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to have to figure out how to work with those parts of rural America that are a constituency for all the stuff we're talking about now.
Well, I think at lunch we're going to have a nice little opportunity to test our bipartisan, getting down into details. But now, I'm just always so amazed of how many great people, you will be first, that there are. You will be second. Bob, you'll be third. How many great people there are on this. We have nature as our ally. We have so many great people creating these breakthroughs, and it's just amazing that we're not there yet. But we are on the cusp. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Gerald White. I represent the Blackfeet Nation out of Montana. I'm also the chair of the National Tribal Environmental Fund. And scholarship recipient to the meeting here. But I'd like to say that the first climate change meeting I went to was a year and a half ago down at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And as they spoke a lot, and I've heard it said up here about rural populations, low income, people of color, and needless to say, the many tribal nations across the United States. And we talked about they talked about them being the most impacted peoples when it comes to climate change, global warming. And I had made a statement to saying that we're some of the most impacted part of the populations. We would like to be at the table. We'd like to be sitting up there with you guys and providing the leadership that we have and what we know, because we're there living it every day. And so we would be your greatest assets to get what
How do we trust the market and the politicians and Wall Street who implement the market as we seek to apply market strategies to carbon management?
Why should we apply market strategies when so far the market and the politics have been to the disadvantage not only of Native American communities, but all disadvantaged communities?
Can I just say, as someone who got his MBA from a noted business school, I don't know why you would want to trust a market per se. But I don't know why you would also want to trust your own instincts in picking the solution. Instead of the many multitudes that are out there, and to unleash the innovation that is this country. This country, it's one of our greatest strengths is invention. So to me, I think it's all about incentives that spark people to scale up things that do work, but then to go pursue other things that might. Because I don't think we have all the solutions right now. And my fundamental belief, and I know Robert gestured to me about cap and trade and offsets, and by the way, WWF is not a big fan of either, for the record. But I do think it is all about creating the incentives for invention to occur and for scaling up to occur with an eye toward not just the voices here, but the real players in the economy, all the way from the biggest companies all the way down to communities where they work and where they live. And I just want to, the other speaker's left already. Here he is. Can I say, sir, I would like to cede, in terms of morality, I really believe that I do not have the moral authority to speak on behalf of communities, only you do. And I would be delighted to give my seat up here on this panel to you right now or in the future, because you're the only one who can speak on behalf of the communities where you live. It's your voice that matters. And I think your voice matters not just on panels, but when the next generation of climate policy is put together, to make sure your voice is at the table, and your voice is at the table with companies and the rest. It's not, we're at risk if we speak on behalf of communities where we're not the leader that the community recognizes itself. So I love the point that you made.
Here, I'll actually follow up on the question as well, and I think I completely agree with the point Carter just made. So when I was at Environmental Defense Fund, I was the market guy, I was the offsets guy, I was the guy out promoting carbon offsets, right? And when I got to USDA, we helped work with farmers and even some actually tribal landowners in Washington State and elsewhere. We put incentives to see could we test new methodologies and those sort of things. And the more I've worked with offsets, the more I realize we're actually going to need more than offsets. Offsets are a potentially useful tool if we use them right, but your point is, well, there are people on the environment side that are skeptical. Are they real? Do we have certain environmental benefits? There are people on the landowner sides, the tribes, others who say, hey, are these markets real? Are they going to be around? And that's why I think as the climate community, we actually have to start thinking about, we're going to have to put real dollars on the table. The taxpayer is potentially actually going to have to put dollars forward. Now, there's a way to do that taps into the type of innovative approach that Carter's talking about, where we can try and capture innovation, where we can partner with the private sector. But I think for a long time we've lived in the offsets world on natural climate solutions, and I think we're going to have to do more than that. And we're going to actually have to put dollars on the table. And so as I think about where this issue goes forward, I think that's a really important thing for all of us to recognize.
So I need to get permission to go beyond 11:51. Pardon me? Do you want to be the last question up there?
He said you have permission. I said you have permission.
Oh.
Hey guys, thanks for the great presentation. Lisa, you ask questions to get applause. It's just amazing.
That's my husband.
Oh.
I think all of us would agree that there's climate change is a big problem. We've got to be addressing it now. And yet in this whole conversation, I hear no real sense of urgency, no real sense of, let's say, addressing the political things that need to happen to create a sense of urgency in this country. And what can you do? What's different about what you're saying or doing now than what you might have said a couple, 5 years ago when it seemed a little bit less urgent? How do we get urgency out of it?
Oh, Bob. If I could take the first crack at that.
Please.
So both Bob and I have worked in the environmental world for like 20 years, and it has always been urgent. I mean, it's always been like we have to do it now, and I get it. Like now we really have to do it now. The urgency like beats in our hearts, and it makes you cry. So I would assume that these 4 gentlemen have huge amounts of urgency in their work and in their lives, and they probably spend less time with their kids and grandkids than they wish that they would because they want to see this happen. But I won't put words in your mouth.
The only thing I'd comment here is, and it's probably pretty obvious, is you just have to look at where we can make progress right now. The federal government, well, actually, first of all, Farm Bill was actually quite strong on some of these issues. The Land and Water Conservation Fund was just permanently reauthorized. There's a lot of good stuff happening there, but we're not going to have a comprehensive federal policy in the next 2 years. So focus at the state level. I know there's some qualms and concerns about the California cap and trade system, but the fact is, by our estimates, $6 billion has flowed to the land sector through that cap and trade system, through the allowance revenues, not through offsets. My understanding is Oregon is on the cusp of passing a cap and trade system. There's other states that are looking at it too. So our increasing focus at the Land Trust Alliance is at that level. And I've been in this space a long time as a funder and now running an NGO. We're constantly toggling back and forth between a state-based focus and a federal focus. And right now, it's all state all the time. Can we change things in 2 years in the federal government? Yeah, let's hope. But we are absolutely urgent. I'm sure we're all desperate, but we're hiding that just because we're in public. But we have to move where we can move, and right now it's at the state level.
Can I say also, I'm sorry, I think the environmental movement takes all types. There are folks who scream and stomp and get marches going and all of that, and that's a really important role in our ecosystem. But there are also groups who quite calmly and practically work in partnership with others and highlight solutions, and that's also important. And we all occupy different roles. But I'll never forget having gone to the TED conference a number of times and spent time with Chris Anderson, who teaches people how to give TED Talks. If you really want people to listen to you, don't just scream about the problem. Talk about the problem, but spend most of your time about the genius of the solution, that they can fall in love with that and they want to be a part of that, because that is what draws people to you and want to work with you and want to make things happen. And so I think today we've been talking about solutions rather than just stomping our feet about the urgency of the problem. And frankly, that's the role that WWF plays. It's the role I've spent time in, I think, with my colleague organizations here for many, many years. I think that's the role that we all play, which is that space of constructive solutions, forward-looking, look at partnerships, look at way of reaching people, and don't just scream about the catastrophic future we have in front of us. I think we all know about that. And I think we're going to draw people to these solutions in a way by talking about how they work, how they benefit people, and to do it in just the right way.
So that's how we work at the Nature Conservancy. That's our approach. But as an organization, I don't think we see any issue more urgent than this one. The urgency of this issue drives us. I mean, we as an organization have decided that climate change really is the issue that if we don't urgently address, everything else we care about will be harmed. And so there is a great sense of urgency. It does get us out of bed every morning and does drive what we do. And sometimes I'm the optimist. I try to be. And I do think there is a changing conversation in this country, and some of that is driven by a newfound understanding that this issue may be a lot more urgent than we ever thought it was. I think when you look at wildfires and hurricanes and these things that have happened for years, but there's a new focus and there's a new conversation, and we have to figure out how to, I think, harness that in a smart way to drive the political conversation forward. And I hope we're at a turning point where that does result in ambitious action, and soon, because we do need to act soon.
And I'll just build on your final point. So I noticed when I was at USDA after the 2012 drought that the conversation with agriculture started to change around climate. There's a recognition that, you know what, this is actually, things are starting to look different. They see it every day. They see that the planting seasons have changed. They've seen extreme weather events. My family owns forests in South Carolina. We had three 10-inch rain events in 1 month. On our place down there. Rural sees this. The opportunity for us is not to have a debate with them about what's causing it, climate change, all that stuff, but to look at ways to align their incentives with what we want to do. And so I think there's an opportunity to actually create some urgency, just as you talked about, around some of the things that folks in rural, who may not be typical allies of the environmental community, but the things that they're seeing. And I think we get this issue right, that we can actually bring a lot of those folks in.
So let's continue this conversation over lunch and this afternoon and tomorrow, because it is about solutions. With all respect, I have always hoped that climate change would be our come to Jesus. It is nature's way of telling us, stop, like just stop doing these ridiculous things that you're doing. And so maybe what is that? Somebody did this in kindergarten. They say, or the
Talk
kids
to the
say,
hand.
What is it?
Talk
to the hand. Yeah. Stop in the name of love. And, and so we will stop not only emitting carbon, but so many of the other degradations that we do to each other and the planet.